How you doing, Dustin?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I am going to just segue right into your presentation. I know that there's going to be a lot of people here for this because a lot of the reason why people come over to Kadence is because they've been using a page builder or they've been using tons and tons of plugins in order to do something. And then they hear about this like lighthouse thing with green circles and wonder why they're not getting it. But you have
Yeah,
some answers, don't you?
I have a couple.
You've got a couple. Great. And Dustin, you and I have kind of become friends on Twitter because you are really putting some energy out there and educating people about how to do more with WordPress, how to do things even with security, and how to make their sites more performant. You
Yes,
are the CEO of Iridium Hosting, and you live in Washington State
that's
on
correct.
the dry side.
The dry side.
The dry side. And you've been using WordPress since 2007, and I'm just going to call you the most helpful person in WordPress on Twitter right now. Can I just
Oh,
call it?
thanks. I
All
appreciate
right,
that.
cool. Well, if you have a screen share, go ahead and hit that present button down below. And if you have some slides or things that you're going to show,
Yeah,
and I am going to I'm going to show myself out and let you have the floor and let you give your presentation. I will manage some of the chat type of things happening here on YouTube and Facebook. And I'll be back as soon as you're done to talk about things and get questions answered and to have a good time.
sure.
That's what
Can
we're
you
here
see my
for.
screen?
I can see it, and I'm just going
Okay.
to add it to that styling. I'm going to actually make that big. Should I make it big? Do you like it big like that?
I can't. It's taken over my full screen, so I'm not sure
Okay.
what you're seeing. So
All
we'll
right.
just call it big.
Okay.
So I'll
Yeah.
work
I'm
through
going to
this.
have a great session. We'll see you soon.
Yeah, thanks. All right, everyone. Um, WordPress doesn't have to be slow. Just like Robert got done telling us that WordPress doesn't have to be insecure, WordPress doesn't have to be slow. So here's our quick agenda. Number one, who am I? Um, number two, what slows websites down? Number three, we'll talk about core web vitals. With number four, we will talk about the speed test tools. On number five, we'll talk about optimization plugins. And number six, Cloudflare. Number seven, where to reach me, and then we'll end up with a little Q&A. So, who is Dustin Hyle? As Kathy said, I am the founder of Iridium Hosting. I also deliver WordPress maintenance and management services there. So I'm not just worried about the servers. While servers is something I'm deeply passionate about, I know that everyone in WordPress has a lot more to worry about with that than just their server they're hosted on. You know, you have to worry about plugin updates, WordPress speed, like we're talking about here. Um, so I do all those services as well at Iridium Hosting. So I've been using WordPress since 2007. I've managed servers at two of the largest cloud providers. I've worked at both Microsoft and Amazon. So what slows websites down? The most things that I find that slow websites down is images, scripts, and requests. And I'm going to show a little demo a little bit later using some of the tools, and that will kind of help you see how it can impact. But usually with images, the biggest thing I find is people using PNG files. PNG files are great if you have to have transparency in your image. You know, like if you're going to have a logo with a background that could be changing, or it's across the background that has a like division of a color or a texture behind it. You'll want to use maybe a PNG or even a WebP for that to have the transparency. Outside of that, you should be using JPEGs, and you should be using very well optimized JPEGs for your site. The next thing is scripts. This is usually JavaScript these days, but it could be other scripts as well. Pretty much any animation or change to your page after it loads is going to be done by JavaScript. So the biggest thing here is usually ad providers. Unfortunately, that's if your site is dealing with display ads, which, hey, everyone needs to make money, so cool. But knowing that, you have to make compromises there with your speed. So what I recommend is, especially for those who are running ads, that you optimize everything else on your site. So even if you're taking a hit for the ads JavaScript, that it's not going to totally cripple your site based on, your ad provider providing JavaScript and then you having like animations on your website or um, little things that load to give, a cool effect or whatever, that will also add to it. And then requests. Every single item on your web page that has to be loaded is a separate request. And these requests could be to your server directly, or it could be a request out to a third-party server. And limiting the requests to third parties is huge because every single time you have to make a connection to a new server, that adds just a little bit of extra overhead too. So if you could minimize your external requests and then also even your internal requests, but the external requests are usually something that you want to avoid more so than the internal ones. So let's talk about Core Web Vitals here. Core Web Vitals is something that Google has been pushing recently. It's to make sure that people have a better experience on your site. Most people are going to hit the back button if your site takes too long to load, or if your site is moving around a lot when it does load. It creates a bad experience and they just hit back. Well, why you care about this is because user metrics are huge for SEO. Like Google has Chrome browser, they're definitely looking and seeing what type of things are happening when people go to different websites. So a good experience is someone comes to your site, they wait for everything to load, they spend some time reading through it, then they click through to like another page on your site. But if your site is slow and has poor core web vitals in this case, you would click, that user would be clicking back before spending that time on your site. And so that's really important. So speed is not only a factor for like comparative directly to another site, but also for those user metrics, because those user metrics are going to impact where you're ranking as well. So let's talk about the three pieces of Core Web Vitals that matter. So largest contentful paint, total blocking time, and cumulative layout shift. So largest contentful paint is how long it takes the largest image or block of text to load. Basically, anything that you see on the above the fold content at the top of your page that's loading, the largest item on that page is what Google is going to consider the largest contentful paint. Total blocking time, also called TBT, is the time between the first contentful paint and time to interactive. So first contentful paint is different than largest contentful paint. First contentful paint is the first things that you see appear on a site when you load it in your browser. And then time to interactive is when a web page first starts loading, like you can't click on items or scroll around. So the time to interactive is when you can start actually interacting with the page. This can be a little bit tricky in testers though, because some of the testers will report time to interactive that is longer than it really is in reality. And I think that most of that is caused by lazy loading certain scripts. So some of the things you can be doing to increase actual performance can throw off some of these testing tools, and even Google's Core Web Vitals tests as well. And then the third Core Web Vital you need to be paying attention to is cumulative layout shift. And this is when, as your page is loading, like elements of the page are moving around the screen. So, for example, let's say that you have a featured image at the top of your post. Well, if your code is not set up correctly, it will load in the text faster than the image loads. So it could put the text at the very top of your screen, but then as soon as that image loads, it moves that text down, below the image. So that's what that layout shift that they're talking about there. So the three tools that I use most commonly for testing and telling me what's wrong with Core Web Vitals and page speed are GTmetrix, Web Page Test, and Page Speed Insights. I generally go to GTmetrix first, and how I use that is I really like their waterfall. And a waterfall is just showing the every element loading and how long it takes and what size the element is. So that is what you can look at to see, hey, what's taking the longest times in my page loading, or what is delaying other items from loading. And I'll show an example here in a minute. But I start with GTmetrix because their waterfall is sortable. And one of the columns is size. And what I will do is first thing, I'll switch it to the largest size item first. And a lot of times you can use this to find like an image that wasn't optimized or a script that's just really large. And so those are usually your biggest wins, is when you can remove something that's being a big weight on the site, or optimize it so that it's no longer a big weight on the site. Then web page test. Web page test is a tool very similar to GTmetrix. What I like using it for is I use their Core Web Vitals test. My favorite piece of that is checking for the cumulative layout shift. It's going to show you, it gives you like a couple of screenshots that are animated that show you what is moving as it loads. Because sometimes when you go to the site, it's fast enough that visually, when you load it in the browser, you can't see exactly what is changing to cause the layout shift. So web page test will do a recording and show you what is moving around, so you can figure out, oh, hey, it's this featured image, and how I can make it not the page not move around is I can say, I know my featured image is 300 pixels high, so I'll set the div that is holding that image to have a fixed height of 300 pixels. So that way, when it loads, the content, like the text content, automatically loads in the right spot, even though the image is not there yet. When it does load, it's not going to move that text around. And then lastly, we have Page Speed Insights. So Page Speed Insights is the one everyone uses for the numbers, the performance percentages and the little colored wheels like Kathy was talking about. With Page Speed Insights, though, it's usually my last stop, because while Page Speed Insights is giving you like, hey, you have a problem with your cumulative layout shift, or your first contentful paint, or your largest contentful paint, a lot of times the data it gives you that tells you what's wrong isn't enough of the picture to be able to make actions. So unless you know exactly what is going on with each type of test, you can't use that really as actionable data. So I would suggest starting with the other two and working your way through it, So once you knock out most of the big things with the first two, then page speed insights can be like your sanity check to just make sure that, hey, you got everything, or oh, actually you need to work on this other thing. And with all these tools, you want to make sure that you're testing both the mobile and the desktop version, because it loads differently for both for the cumulative layout shift, because everything's a different size on a mobile phone or even an iPad potentially, but also it tests it at a slower speed. And some files that may not seem like a big deal on desktop, it that won't affect total blocking time or things like that. But if you slow them down, their loading process, it actually can create a more of a chain reaction of little issues that you're not seeing on the desktop, for example. So let's just do a quick example of this. So I will bring this screen over. All right. So I picked on The Verge, and the only reason I picked on The Verge was they're a big site, and it's not calling out like any one of my customers or anything like that. So um, here is the example of web page tests, core web vitals. And what you'll see here is the largest contentful paint, like I talked about, the cumulative layout shift, and the total blocking time here. So as I said earlier, the total blocking time, sometimes tools, don't display it right because of different scripts, how different scripts run. So in this case, I know for a fact that while The Verge has some issues with their speed, it's a pretty fast site, and it doesn't really have a total blocking time of 9.92 seconds. So you do have to take some of these tools with a grain of salt, and also compare it against others, because sometimes tools will activate lazy loading differently and things like that. And so you can get a better idea if you use the tools together. So what you can do here is if you click on any of these numbers, it will take you to that section of the report. So like if I were to click here, it just pulls me down to largest contentful paint. So you can see here that the featured text is the largest item on the page in this case. And so um, using this is helpful because when you're trying to improve this score, you want to make sure that anything that loads before this text is what you're looking to optimize. While it's good to optimize everything, it's most important to go for that largest contentful paint first. So for example, something that could throw this off that would load first would be their logo. So if your site has a logo that is giant, like 2000 pixels wide, it's a ping, it's like 300 kilobytes, like that loading can affect your largest contentful paint because it's loading above the featured text here. And it might not be something that you even see on the page that is loading. I mean, obviously the logo is loading, the menu's loading above it, but there could also be scripts that you put in your header, Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager, a script for your ads plugin or your ads provider, things like that. So if you continue scrolling down here, here is the waterfall that I was talking about earlier. So this is every single file that is loading to make up that web page. And you can see they have a lot of WOOF2 files, and those are font files. So a big speed tip here is use system safe fonts, or web safe fonts. And what web safe fonts are is fonts that are found on every computer. No matter what operating system, if you're on Windows or Mac, like they will generally have those fonts pre-installed. So the benefit of that is you don't have to load in any fonts if you're loading it, if you're telling your site to use a website font. There's also a font called System Font that I know like Kadence has built in to use, for example. And system font, the font will vary between operating systems because it is like tailored to that operating system, but it is not one that gets loaded separately. So it's just like the web safe font. However, the only thing with using the system font is the appearance is going to change depending on what OS is. But some people like that little added feature too. So if you look here, there's a lot of JS files, which is JavaScript loading. In their case, it's good. These are not up at the top. So they're not slowing down your largest contentful paint and your first contentful paint. If you see this little icon here, the white X on top of the orange circle, it will show up. In this case, we don't have a good example, unfortunately, for that, but it will show up here in the list of the items, and it will tell you if it's a render blocking resource. And that is useful for fixing your total blocking time. So if something is actually blocking the page from loading further before it's done loading that element, that is an item that you can either remove or delay, things like that. A lot of the optimization plugins will allow you to delay JavaScript. And that is, JavaScript is usually the biggest thing that I run into that's a render blocking resource. So this waterfall is really good for showing that when that is an issue. So here, if we go down to cumulative layout shift, unfortunately, they don't have any because it's a good site, good on them. But right here, it would show the little animated images showing what is causing your layout shift. Down here is showing the total blocking time. Here is an example, like I just talked about, actually, of showing that this resource is blocking. In this case, it's Google Tag Manager. And that is actually something that I find often. Google is telling everyone, hey, you have to have a fast performance site, but they're a really big company and not all their teams talk together, because a lot of times things that slow down your site are unfortunately released from Google. So that's all I like to look at here on Web Page Test. But let's go quickly over to GTmetrix. And I already pulled up the waterfall page, but when you run a test, it will look like this. It will give you a couple items that you might want to read through and see if there's anything that you want to look for to fix. Another quick thing you can look here is you can look at your total page size. Reducing this as much as possible always is a good thing. I like most pages to be under a megabyte, and it will show you the breakdown of what is using up your space. So in this case, they have a lot of JavaScript. Many sites that I work on, I see a lot of images being the big item, but that's something that you can work on just depending on what your site is. But my favorite part of GTmetrix is their waterfall. And I come here, and the first thing I do is I sort this by size to figure out what the largest items are. So in this case, their largest item is some JavaScript file that is 313 KB. Obviously, you can't control, like, from your ad provider what JavaScript size is, but if you have anything other than something from your ad provider that is more than like 150 KB, that really you should be looking about removing that or optimizing it down. So images, for example, if you have an image that's above 150 KB, you definitely need to be doing some optimization there, resizing it and also compressing it, and or putting it in a proper file type. So if it's a ping and it's, your featured image, probably should be a JPEG or possibly a WebP. So that's what I would say about that. And then you come to page speed insights. and you see that they're passing Core Web Vitals, which is great because it cares mostly about the top 3 here, which is what you see in your Google Search Console. However, they do have some elements that Google's PageSpeed Insight tool says that they can work on. So reducing unused JavaScript, as we saw in the previous waterfalls, they had a lot of JavaScript on their site. So this is just saying, hey, you should optimize it or remove it. And minimizing main thread work. Again, in this case, it's saying that 10 seconds was spent on working through those scripts. So those are the types of things you're looking for here. Basically, if you've done most of the things that we talked about on the 2 waterfalls, many of these things will start to go away. We'll go back to the presentation. So that is the tools that I use for looking at page speed. All right, so optimization plugins. When it comes to WordPress, you're going to be doing a couple of things. You're going to be removing items that are unnecessary. You're going to be optimizing images. But then if you are dealing with having JavaScript loaded on your site, your CSS files, which control the styles of your site, you're going to want to optimize those, the ones that you can't get rid of. So there's lots of optimization plugins. And I say optimization plugins, people started with caching plugins because most of the plugins for performance in WordPress started as their one trick was doing caching. Now, caching is kind of the norm. Like pretty much anything to do with optimization in WordPress can do caching in WordPress. So when it comes to the optimization plugins, you're really looking for other stuff like removing unused elements, JavaScript optimization, JavaScript deferral, your CSS deferral, how it loads, if it's asynchronous or not. If you remove elements from the CSS that aren't actually used on every page, a lot of times, like when you have a CSS file, you have just one CSS file for the whole site. But some of the elements in that CSS file may not be loaded on every page of the site. So some of these plugins can actually remove pieces of that CSS and save the cached version. So here are generally the ones that you hear most about, and the ones that I use across different clients depending on their needs. So I'll give a little opinion on how I use which one where. So WP Rocket is a paid plugin. What I find is it's the best overall. And what I mean best overall is it fits most people's situations without having a lot of like settings you have to tweak to really dial it in and get it fast. It's going to do a 90% job for most people with just a couple of clicks. So that's one reason I like it. But just because of that, that doesn't mean it's the best for everyone. It just is the best in most situations. WP Fastest Cache, it is a great plugin as well. The support for it is amazing. The one big benefit for WP Fastest Cache over WP Rocket is WP Rocket has a yearly fee to continue to get support and updates. WP Fastest Cache is a one-time payment for their paid version per site. And so if you only have one site or a couple of sites, it may make financial sense to get that support. If you are willing to use that support a little bit, you can get dialed in just as fast, if not faster, than WP Rocket with fastest cache. However, out of the box, it's not quite as fast. And then Perf Matters. Perf Matters, it does a lot of things that the rest of these don't use. It can remove kind of generic elements from WordPress, like the built-in emojis. It can help you remove scripts from loading on certain pages. So if you have a plugin that loads a script on every single page of your site, but you only need that script to actually load on one page. For example, with that, like Contact Form 7, for example, you only need that plugin to help with your contact form on your contact page, right? Well, it generally loads files on every single page of your site by default. So you can go in with Perf Matters and you can say, hey, I want to only load it on this specific page. And you can do things like that. So I hear flying press from from a lot of people who are very qualified say that flying press is an even better option than WP Rocket for most people. I haven't had enough time to test it, and it has a licensing um, uh, program that works really well for people with single sites or a few sites. Unfortunately, WP Rocket has an unlimited license, which is really helpful for people who are managing a lot of sites like myself. So it may be worth taking a look at Flying Press. Optimize is one of the old winners that continues to do well. They aren't a full suite like some of these other plugins, but what they do is they optimize the JavaScript and CSS very, very well. If you are on an ad provider like a Zoic that doesn't allow you to use a lot of these other plugins, you can use Auto Optimize with the Zoic's provided Leap to get a little bit better performance out of their system, since you can't use the caching plugins and other things like WP Rocket, Flying Press, etc. with a Zoic, for example. So then there's Lightspeed Cache. Lightspeed Cache is free. It works best with servers that are running Lightspeed. Not every server runs Lightspeed, so that's something you need to know about. To get the best results with it, you really have to know what you're doing and understand. And so that's why, even though it's a free option, I generally don't recommend it for most people. I do, however, recommend it for people that are taking the time to understand or already know the different things that they need to do for speed. And then host provided. So with some hosts, they're providing their own. For example, SiteGround, they have their SG Optimizer. Cloudways has Breeze. Generally speaking, to get the best out of their platforms, if you're on their hosting, you should probably be using their plugin. I know that you can't access all of the caching options on SiteGround at the server level caching if you are not using SG Optimizer. So you could even potentially be using a WP Rocket with their no cache option, and even load that in conjunction with SiteGround Optimizer. But WP Rocket, for example, won't be able to get to the server level caching stuff that SG Optimizer. So some of these plugins can be used in conjunction with each other. Most commonly, WP Rocket and Perf Matters I run together a lot of times. However, if you're going to add multiple of any plugin, really understand why you're doing it and make sure that you're not duplicating efforts. You're not having both of them turned on to do CSS optimization or JavaScript optimization. You can create a lot of problems for yourself having, even outside of optimization plugins, any plugins that have duplicate duties. So the next thing that I talk about when I talk about speed is Cloudflare. And some people are like, why do you always talk about Cloudflare? Well, I have nothing to do with Cloudflare, but I love their service, and they are something that you really need to be using if you don't have something like security or another specific scenario like a Zoic that provides a CDN. You should be using Cloudflare. And the reason for this is both for speed and for security. So Cloudflare sits in front of your website, and it is going to be the first thing that gets hit. And that is good for a couple things. One, um, their network is very large, so they're seeing all kinds of things coming in against all these sites. And so they have their ability for firewalling. They can block at their servers, so it never even gets to your server. And they have the intelligence because they are on so many sites that they can create great rules at the firewall level to help to help your site. And then on the speed side of it, they take and they make a cached copy of your files and they put it at servers all around the world so that it's closer and faster for the user. So if you have your website is hosted in the US, let's just say in California. So your server's in California. The people in California, if they were to go to your server, they're probably going to have a faster experience than someone coming from, say, London, um, because it's a much farther jump to go between the two. You're going to have a lot of hops along the way, and at every hop is a potential for slowdown and added delay. So Cloudflare will take and move your files all around the world to make a better experience for someone. So I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh, well, I can make my site is actually faster without Cloudflare." And yes, that may be the case. I can optimize a server for a specific geographic area, and it will be faster than Cloudflare, bypassing their CDN and everything else. However, you're not going to be able to do that yourself when it comes to the global coming in from all geographies. So that's why you need to be using something like Cloudflare. And when you do use Cloudflare, make sure that you hook it up via API to any of the plugins that I talked about on the previous slide. So that way, when you make changes on your site, those plugins connected to Cloudflare will tell Cloudflare, clear the cache, load a more recent version of the file, and that will keep you from having kind of weird issues when you update your site, yet when visitors go to your site, they're not seeing the updates. So that's all I have to say about WordPress optimization today. You can reach me at iridiumhosting.com. I have hosting and management services there. We do page speed optimizations as well. You can also reach me on Twitter, like Kathy said earlier. I have a goal for 2023, a personal goal, to try to be the most helpful person talking about WordPress on Twitter. So if you have any questions about anything, not just performance, speed, anything about WordPress, ask me there, and I'm going to try to give that information out to everyone. I'm at Dustin Hyle pretty much everywhere else. So, Kathy, if you're still around, we'll go into Q&A maybe.
Yeah. How could I go anywhere? I'm like taking notes, dude. That was some really great information. And I really appreciated the fact that you went into core web vitals and what that all means. And, I've been exposed to all of that stuff, but you got into a lot of the nuances of it, like the fact, like the largest contentful paint. That is so hard to say.
All of the core web vitals are hard to talk about.
Really?
Cumulative, like that is impossible.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Google's really giving us the test. Like, can you really talk about this? Let's see. Practice it a few times.
Yeah,
It's
how
been kind
about
of
EEAT?
Yeah, just throw that extra E in there to keep things
Yeah.
complicated. Jeez, we'll get into more of that in the SEO session. But
Yeah,
yes,
for sure.
so largest contentful paint. I have to say it
Yes.
slow. That's just what's loading on the viewport, right? So like
It's
on
the
a
largest item in the viewport, which could be text or it could be an image. Most people, it's an image. However, if you have really big text, a large font size, and a long title, it could be the largest. Like in our example on The Verge, the
yeah.
largest was actually the text and not the image.
Okay, cool. All right, that's really good distinctions to make. Can you talk a little bit about, I know lots of people talk about um, mobile versus desktop, and
Yep.
mobile scores are much harder to get, all those green circles and everything for. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the difference between them and what maybe what we're looking for there?
So with mobile versus desktop, the biggest thing is speed. And so, if you're sitting at home, you may have a cable internet connection, but a lot of the world is, when they're on mobile, is on 4G or less. And so they're not having this amount of speed that you have sitting at your cable connection. That is impacted in multiple ways. It's having elements that take up a lot of space. So unoptimized images, for example, that's like a huge win, especially for mobile. Um, but also, you run into situations where something loads faster on the desktop because of your faster connection, and it might not have any um, issues or domino effects, but on mobile, if one item loads a little bit slower, it could cause more blocking events, like we talked about. And so it can be a domino effect of the one item is not itself a problem, but it slows down the whole chain in the waterfall, which creates an overall problem. So really, for mobile, the biggest thing is reducing file sizes of every file you can, and also, if it's not needed, remove it. Like if you have this little animation, like sure, some people are going to be like, "Oh, that's so cool." But when it comes to it, like your website visitor doesn't care about you, unfortunately, and they care about filling their needs. So if, they're looking up how to change the oil on their car, they really aren't going to care if your website has a really cool animation on it. So think about everything you can remove that doesn't fit the user's intent.
Right. Right. So the fastest web page or website is going to be like an HTML page with just text on it, right? Hardly anything
Yes,
there. And then we've
unfortunately.
got we've got these sites that have animations, we've got videos embedded, we've got larger images and a hero section, and wow, they look really flashy and great, but
Yeah.
there's where do you draw this line of a continuum of like the perfect fast page versus something that's very, very flashy? Can you give people some just like overall guidance on like how they should think about their site or a page?
Sure. So with that, you can have really good looking themes that aren't heavy. Example, Kadence. Kadence looks really good. Um, Another one is Generate Press. I use both of them all the time. So I'm not just shilling for one, but you know, you have to really look at the overall um, like environment of your site. So, looking at the theme, like you can have things that look good without it being heavy. Images, you can have images on your site. That's fine. But make sure that you are optimizing them for the size, the location where they're at. So, if you use any of your browsers, you right click on an image and you say inspect, you can look, it will show you what size in pixels that it's loading. It could be like 300 pixels wide by 200 pixels tall. Well, a lot of times people will just take their phone and take a picture. Well, that is going to be thousands of pixels. That's the word megapixels. Well, on a website, you're not going to have a 4,000 pixel wide image. It just doesn't happen unless you have like a specific diagram you're like trying to get people to zoom in. But loading on the page without having side scrolling, you're never going to have a 4,000 pixel wide image. And so knowing your site and your theme, like what sizes of files it uses for what, um, and then optimizing it. So for example, your sidebar, you might know that your sidebar is never going to be wider than 300 pixels. So any images that are going to show up in your sidebar, even if that image is used somewhere else on the site, create another version of it that is only 300 pixels wide so that you're not loading a giant file when you don't need to. The one caveat to that is if you are using Google Discover, or you have a topic that works well for Google Discover needs to have 1200 pixel wide images. So for your featured images on your site, you probably, even if your site isn't 1200 pixels wide for that featured image, you might want to set your featured image to 1200 pixels when it uploads.
Very, very good advice right there. And it's also another thing to mention is to know your audience, to pay attention to your analytics. Where's your traffic coming from? Are these people on desktop for the most part, or are they on mobile? So like if you have like 80% of your customers coming to your site on desktop and that's your primary audience and how they interact with your brand, maybe don't like stress out too much about mobile. Would that be good
So
advice?
So I would say, yeah, you can generally not stress as much, but if you make a site that loads fast on mobile, it's going to load fast on desktop.
True. Good point. See, this is why you're here, the expert. And we've got some questions from our audience. Ben Anderson is asking if light speed plus perf matters is a good combination.
Sure, it's a great combination. Just make sure that you don't have the minification of your JavaScript and your CSS turned on both. Pick one or the other.
Very good. Yeah, I know of one site that's they're using a plugin for optimization. They're using caching on the server, and then they're using Cloudflare too.
Hmm.
And it can get complicated knowing where something is stuck.
Yeah.
Any advice on that?
Well, that's kind of why I said for most people, I say WP Rocket just is kind of it will never be the absolute fastest for all situations, but it can be for most situations. It can get you 90% of the way there. That with Cloudflare tied in. Um, Outside of that, you kind of got to dig a little bit deeper and understand why you're doing what you're doing. Can't just blindly go about it if you're going any deeper than a single plugin usually.
Great. Ben has another question about your page speed optimization services. Is it difficult for you when you didn't build the site yourself? And could you get a good result even if the customer wants to keep their old theme, their builder? Like, how do you manage all of that?
Yeah, that's tough. Depending on how the site is put together, I do unfortunately have to do a lot of theme changes, and also removing page builders is a big thing right now. Um, I don't care how many developers or designers that think they're developers want to use a page builder. If you're using a page builder outside of Gutenberg, you are adding stuff to the site, no matter what. It has to have files to load, and so it's never going to be as fast. You can make it fast, and I will totally agree with that, but it's never going to be as fast as using less. Back to what you said about a single HTML page with just text on it.
Yeah. Another question about WebP images. What's the status on that? Are all browsers using those? Is it a good choice?
So only since the last like 2 years are all browsers using them, but you have people that are not necessarily running the most up-to-date browsers. Um, I'm in the US, and thankfully we have a lot of resources for that. But there are, a lot of people around the world that don't have. So it partially depends on your audience. So as a general rule, when I optimize images, I try to use JPEG as most as possible because if you're using a good optimization, optimization tool for images, you can get JPEGs down to be in the same size almost always as a WebP. The exception to that is transparency. JPEGs just don't do transparency, so that's not an option. So for that, you need to be using a PNG or a WebP. But being that we're only 2 years into every main browser supporting it, I still like to lean on JPEG. And I use squish.app, which is a free image optimization to get using their Moz JPEG compression engine.
Okay. And then Mike has a question. What do you think about using plugins like Short Pixel Image Optimizer, or, there's tons of other ones out there too, like Smush and whatnot, to
Right.
do the optimization in the admin dashboard?
So I would say that there's only like 2 or 3 that are any good. And like you just mentioned, Smush, it's not good. It doesn't
It's not.
get good results. Both on the visual output, it will generally tend to make the pictures more blurry, and it
Okay.
also doesn't reduce the file size nearly as much. Short Pixel and Imagify both do a really good job.
Okay.
However, they aren't going to fix all scenarios, and they can end up over optimizing some images if the images are way too big to begin with. They do much better if the image is already kind of close to where it should be, physical size-wise, like dimensional size-wise. So I would say that. If you are going to use an image plugin, you need to really think about if you're going to have it keep a copy of the originals or not. By default, they all keep the originals, which is great if they screw up an image or make it too over optimized and blurry. However, that also adds to your hosting. So a lot of my clients are the like recipes and food type bloggers who have a ton of pictures,
Mm.
and that keeping that original can get really, really big and increase your hosting costs significantly, because when you're on a large site that's no longer on shared hosting that offers unlimited storage, you're paying for all of your storage, and that can be expensive over time if you have a lot of traffic and you have a lot of storage needs.
Right. And then there's also the idea of like taking those types of resources and then putting them in like a bucket or somewhat, putting them off server.
Yeah,
But then you get warnings about pulling in resources from other places. Do you have any thoughts on that?
it's also going to load slower, generally
Yeah.
speaking, because
Okay.
it's adding another third-party request.
Right.
Um, So what I suggest for most people is to use something like Squish on your PC, which like I said is free. If you're on a Mac, Pixelmator Pro, you can use that to automate. And with that, you can even create a shortcut, and they have guides how to do that on their site. You can create a shortcut to basically be able to right click on a file and tell it to optimize. And you can, in the shortcut, you can define, hey, 1200 pixels is the max width for all these. And so when it does, it will automatically optimize it to like a WebP, for example, with 1200 pixels wide. So
Okay.
that's an option there. I haven't found a good automated option like that for Windows, which I use Windows most of the time. I have both, but when I'm on Windows, I just go to squish.app in my browser, which is free, tool provided by Google even. So
Great. Okay. So Ben has a follow-up question on what he was talking about earlier with your page speed optimization services. Do you
mhm.
actually end up like having to rebuild people's sites in order to get what
so
you need?
so usually um, that is with a client that I'm doing more than just page speed. We have a full plan of what they're wanting to accomplish, and usually that's when it comes into more talk about, okay, we're going to pull out a page builder, we're going to do a redesign. My generally, as a page speed as a service, is not that at all. It is installing optimization plugins, setting them appropriately, resizing images, things like that.
Amazing. Great. Okay, we've got another question. What about ew? Can I just call it ew? Image compression that sends images to a CDN and loads from there. Thoughts on that?
So I like using Cloudflare as my CDN, and I like having all of my resources in one place so you aren't doing another third-party load.
Right.
I don't know specifically about you because I don't use it. So I can't tell you if their compression is good. But I think since they are offering a CDN approach, they probably aren't doing the calculations and compression on your server itself. Similar to what Short Pixel and Imagify do, they send it off so that math that has to be done to compress is not tying up your server. Like the free version of Smush, for example, it's going to use your server's resources wherever you're hosted to do those calculations and compressions. So that's one reason why I don't like it, outside of it
Yeah.
not actually reducing the file size a lot.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. One note about Cloudflare too, and another recommendation,
Mhm.
if there ever was like a DDoS attack on your site, let's say you're huge, you get big and you get a competitor that decides we don't like you anymore, or it's just
Yeah,
some random ransomware type of thing. Having that already set up on your site just gives you that, you just go to under attack mode. It's already there for you. So having that set up ahead of time there's just so many reasons to use Cloudflare for optimization reasons, but also for security reasons. It's just,
absolutely.
being absolutely prepared. The whole idea of securing your site is, just assume you're going to get hacked. And what are you going to deal with any kind of attack? And so having that Cloudflare just something that's taking the requests from the wide internet before it hits your server so recommended. So I
Not
just want
only
to
that, it is going to reduce your hosting costs significantly too,
right,
because
right.
you're not having to send all that data from your server. I have people on shared hosting that are getting over 200,000 page views a month, and they're still on shared hosting, and their sites are loading just fine because most of their site is loading from Cloudflare itself. So that
Amazing.
that does not work, however, if you are e-commerce or a membership site where you have to have uncached elements. You do need a big server if you're going to be doing that at any kind of scale. So
At any scale. Yeah, yeah, definitely. All right. Some more questions. And we're gonna have to power through these. What about AVIF images?
I don't use them. I go to JPEG for everything I can. Um, WebP sometimes. Outside of
Yeah.
that,
Okay. Cool. And then Ben is curious on how you price your page services. You don't have to answer this if you don't want to.
it depends. Like with everything, it depends. So I will generally do a quick audit. Just run it through the tools and figure out how big of a thing it is. Early on in my career, I did flat rate page speed, and unfortunately, that's not sustainable because everyone has different needs. Everyone has different themes. Everyone has different amount of images on their site.
Yep. Got to quote that based on what you're dealing with. And
Right.
this will be our final question. Does the Save
Okay.
for Web option in Adobe's Photoshop optimize images enough?
That is actually what I used to use before Squish. It does a good job, generally speaking. The only caveat to that is I don't know if recently they've changed their mind, but it was considered a legacy feature that they weren't fully supporting anymore. So that's why I started looking at other options and
Yeah,
have settled on Squish. So
amazing. And then Charlie's curious if you charge for a mini audit. I think you just contact Dustin and he'll let you know how much it costs for whatever if you have a million pages on your site, that's obviously I don't think there's a mini audit available for that, but
no,
talk to Dustin, let him know what you've got and he can quote that for you. Can I answer that for you just that way?
yeah, I mean, if you reach out and you tell me your URL, I can pretty quickly give you a free quote to know how much it would cost to fix your issues.
Great. And go follow Dustin. We're going to wrap this up. We're going to send everybody to your Twitter because you have been doing some really powerful threads lately. It's how we met. You know, we started talking about
Yeah.
Kadence. And I'm like, this guy's got it going on. Hey,
Thank you.
You want to come to Kadence Amplify? And here you are. And this was an
Yes.
amazing session. I'm going to have to rewatch it again just because there was so much data in here. So obviously,
I
if
appreciate
you are
that.
yeah, you did great. And I'm so glad that you were here. We are going to transition into the next speaker. I will talk to you on Twitter. I'm
All
going
right.
to head over there later.
Thank
So
you. Bye, everyone.